Hello everyone, my name is Pritesh Raichura and I'm the Head of Science at Michaela Community School. My talk today is on high quality teacher talk. As more and more people are using direct or explicit instruction in their classrooms, I think there's a real appetite for advice on how teachers can best use the time that they do spend talking in the classroom to increase the progress that pupils make, to make their explanations better, and to make sure that there's really strong behaviour in the lessons. And so that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about today. So first, I'm going to start off by explaining what you can say to encourage pupils to listen. Second, I'm going to talk about how is it that teachers can encourage thinking in the classroom and build that ratio. Third of all, I'm going to speak about how teacher talk can be used to improve behaviour. And lastly, I'm going to speak about observations and giving feedback to teachers so that everybody can improve the quality of their teacher talk so as to promote outcomes for pupils. So, to start off, I'm going to talk about explanations, although I'm only going to touch on it briefly. So the most fundamental thing when we think about teacher talk is giving a really great explanation for the concepts that you are teaching. And of course that's vital because that's the first thing we think of when we think of ourselves as teachers, is delivering really clear explanations that mean our pupils are able to understand and digest that content and then later on be able to apply that knowledge as well. However, I have already spoken about this in another session called Planning Effective Teacher-Led Lessons, which is available to watch on the Research Ed section of the Research Ed YouTube channel. So do take a look at that. What I will be focusing more on in this session is looking at thinking and listening. And the reason for this is you can give the best explanation in the world. It can be really clearly broken down, an explicit, really clear sequence of ideas that you build up in your explanation. You can speak slowly and concisely, and it can seem like you've scripted the perfect explanation. But that will not have any benefit whatsoever if A, the pupils aren't listening, and B, the pupils aren't actually thinking and really grappling with the content, because that's what leads to learning ultimately. So those are the things I'm going to focus on in this talk. And I've used this simple diagram that I've modified from the Teach Like a Champion 2.0 book, which I would highly recommend. It's a book that's fundamentally transformed my teaching practice, and it's something that we use at my school. In fact, my previous school, we used it as well as a way of improving our teaching. And what this graph shows is we've got participation ratio, which is the proportion of the class that are participating in the lesson. And at first, what I'm going to do is talk to you about strategies to improve participation, and then I'm going to talk about how you can not just get participation, but people's thinking about the content of their subjects. And then finally, I'll touch on behavior, as I said earlier. So, number one, we need to do with when considering the quality of our teacher talk is make sure pupils are listening. So, what can we do to increase participation in our classrooms? So, first of all, establish your expectations for when you are talking and then sustain them. Now, this seems quite obvious. We all will have had rules such as if I'm speaking, nobody else should be speaking in the classroom. And of course, this is essential because if the class is talking over you, they're not listening. But it's the sustaining part that I want to talk a bit about today, because it's very easy to let those expectations slide and to occasionally let people talk over you or fidget and not give you their full attention. And if you are a teacher that wants to improve the quality of your teacher talk, then you must at the same time ensure that the attention is there on you when you are speaking, because without the attention, like I said before, it doesn't matter how good your explanation is. So to achieve this, first thing you need to do is make your expectations really explicit. When I am speaking, I expect you to, and communicate to them clearly, and use the behavior system to make sure that pupils do follow those instructions. When they lose concentration and they start fidgeting or they start talking over you, make sure that you follow through and pick them up on it every single time, because without that, the explanation isn't going to have the impact you desire it to. Now, there are three key things that I want to speak about that link to this. The first is the most simple and effective way of increasing the number of people who are paying attention to you, the teacher who's standing at the front giving the explanation, is to make sure that your desks are arranged in rows. And I hope that that's not too controversial, but the moment you have people facing each other, the chances that they're then making eye contact with each other and sharing a joke amongst themselves, or not listening to you but listening and paying attention to what each other are doing, that becomes problematic in terms of them understanding your explanation and learning. And ultimately, the reason we as teachers want our pupils to pay attention to us and listen to us is because we have something really valuable to say. So rows are a really simple way, arranging your desk in rows are a really simple way of increasing the chances that people's attention and focus is on you. It means you can see whether each pupil is looking towards you or towards the board where you want their attention to be. Now, the second is slant. Now, this is something we use at my school, and it's a really simple acronym for making really explicit the expectations that you have for pupils when you are talking. So whenever we want pupils' attention, so between every single transition, so if they're sitting down in their seats, once they've sat down, I would say 3, 2, 1, and slant. When they are finishing off some work and I want them to put their pens down and face me, I would say 3, 2, 1, and slant. Always, between any activity and transition, we use slant. And what that stands for, really simply, is sit up straight, and that means you have nothing in your hands, that you're sitting up, you're facing forwards, you're listening to what the teacher's saying, so your focus needs to be on the teacher, you're answering questions when required to, you are never interrupting, so not speaking over the teacher, and you're tracking the teacher, which means looking towards the teacher or looking towards the board where the teacher may be pointing to or referring to. Now, by using this really simple acronym between every single transition is hugely powerful. Now, the reason I think it works, and it works in pretty much most contexts where I've spoken to teachers about, is because not only have I used this in my classroom and we use it consistently around our school, but when I've done training for other teachers, for unqualified teachers who are wanting to become qualified, I've actually used this strategy with them when I'm delivering my sessions, and I've said to them, look, I want to model what it's like in the classroom. And when before I do it, I always start by first just doing a countdown on its own, saying, right, I want everyone's attention in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and can everyone just make sure they're facing me? And using those kinds of phrases without saying slant. And what I found is the difference between using the word slant and not using the word slant is so powerful, because the word slant becomes associated with, I need to have nothing in my hands, I need to make sure I'm facing the person who's speaking and listening. And actually, I found that it was so much easier to get even the adults' attention when I use slant, because it's different to any other countdown you might use for other reasons. So slant is really powerful. I'd really recommend it as a strategy. The third thing is radar, and this is again a teach like a champion technique. And radar involves making sure you are scanning the room once you've demanded the pupil's attention. So once you've said slant, you're not just carrying on with your explanation, you're then scanning the room, each row in turn, to make sure that no one is fidgeting, all eyes are on you, and that pupils are indeed have stopped talking and are listening. And the more that you do this, and the more exaggerated you make your radar, the quicker the pupils will listen and follow that instruction. And a really nice analogy we use at my school is keeping pupils on the bus. So you have to imagine that when you're giving an explanation, there are some pupils who are on the bus and you're taking them on a journey to understanding whatever key facts you want them to learn or ideas you want them to understand. But during the process, some of them are falling off the bus if they're losing attention. And your job as the teacher with your radar is to make sure that you're stopping them from falling and you're picking them back up and making sure they stay on the bus with you. So you need to make sure you're using non-verbal reminders, whether it's just a quick kind of point back in your direction to show that you need to pay attention to them, or to show them empty hands and fold your arms to model for them how you want them to show you that they're listening. Now, whilst giving an explanation, you need to establish a culture of listening. And you do that firstly by asking really simple comprehension questions during your explanation. So for example, if I was explaining the concept of where photosynthesis is happening, I might say something like, so photosynthesis is a chemical reaction that takes place in the chloroplasts of plants. Now straight away, after saying that one simple fact, I might say to my pupils, so in which part of the cell is photosynthesis taking place? And by doing that, you're making sure that everything you're saying, you're building in an expectation that you could be asking the pupils at any point a question that they must be able to answer. Because if they do not answer that question, you will know immediately that they aren't listening. Because you're not testing understanding, you're not checking that they understand this really difficult concept and that they need to be able to articulate it. It's a really simple comprehension that you would expect them to follow through your explanation. So simple comprehension questions are really powerful because they allow you to check whether or not pupils are listening. And pupils will come to expect to be asked, and that's where you know you've developed a culture where they should be listening at any time because you're asking questions of them. Now, this is a barrier that I faced when I was coming onto my journey of improving my teacher explanations. And I assumed that asking easy questions is actually quite patronizing. And so I shouldn't really be checking in a way that people are listening by asking really easy questions, because they're just going to think, well, this is so easy. Why is my teacher asking me this? Do they think I'm silly? Do they think I can't follow a simple explanation? And actually what I found is if you can narrate the questioning and praise pupils for getting it right appropriately, then it proves hugely motivating. So even as simple as saying, right, I'm just going to check everyone's listening. Really simple questions. What is photosynthesis? Where is it happening in the cell? And they tell you it's a chloroplast. You don't have to go overboard and say, gosh, that's amazing, you gave such a brilliant answer. But just acknowledging, well done, I know you're paying attention, is really important, because it motivates them, because they think, oh yeah, I am following this explanation, and they get used to you building up your questioning as time goes on. And this is hugely liberating for them, because they feel reassured that they're going to be checked upon to make sure they're following. Because once you are a teacher who is using teacher talk well and delivering really good explanations, pupils want to feel like they're able to follow that explanation. And so by asking easy questions to begin with, you're really supporting them to rehearse those really crucial facts early on in the explanation that then allows them to follow the explanation really well. So easy questions are in fact motivating and not patronizing. Use a variety of strategies: cold call, choral response, sometimes known as call and response, and mini whiteboards. So how do these work? Now, cold call is really simple. It just means pupils don't have their hands up and you call on their name to answer a question. The best way to do this is to state the question, pause to give thinking time, and then say a pupil's name. So you might say something like, where in the cell does photosynthesis take place? Rashawn, and expect Rashawn to give you the answer. And the reason for this is you want all the pupils to be thinking about the answer before you call upon a name. Whereas if you call the name first, of course, pupils may feel that if their name wasn't called, they don't have to think about the answer. Choral response is my absolute favorite because it's hugely energizing, it's hugely motivating in the classroom. So saying really simple things like, today we're going to learn about photosynthesis. What process are we learning about today? 1, 2, 3, and expect the whole class to say in unison, photosynthesis. And as you proceed to give your explanation by asking really simple recall questions, using call response really builds energy. And if there are any pupils who are feeling low in energy or not willing to participate, by asking lots of call response questions, the participant the participation ratio should be increasing. And it's like a bit of a warm-up. And by the end of your kind of session of core responses, lots of people will feel really energized and ready to do more challenging work. The problem with cold calling is you pick on one people, the rest aren't answering and they're not participating. Whereas when you do choral response, every single person is participating, and you can keep an eye out and say the names of pupils who aren't actually participating, saying, "I didn't see your mouth move," and as a way of reminding them, "Look, I want you to be answering the next question." And finally, mini whiteboards ensure that all pupils are participating as well, because you can visibly see that everyone's written down an answer. And if it's really simple, as long as you've got a really slick routine for showing whiteboards, wiping them clean, and then slanting so that they're not fidgeting with their whiteboard pens, it can be a really effective way of checking pupils are listening. Now, what you wouldn't do when checking for listening is things like turn to your partner, where they discuss their answer with their partners before sharing, because those aren't the kind of questions you're asking. They're not difficult questions. You're simply checking that they're listening. And by using turn to your partner or equivalent forms where they can confer their answers, you're allowing the half the class potentially not to listen to what you're saying, get the answer from their friend, and then put their hands up and give you the illusion that they are listening, when in fact they are not. So that is something to be wary of. Now, you might be thinking, how can cold call improve participation ratio when you're only picking on one person? But the reason I put that strategy in there is, if you make it unpredictable who you're going to ask, then the implicit assumption there is that anyone could be asked anything at any time and they could be picked on, and no one in the class should feel like that they're never going to be asked a question. So it's really useful when mixed with the other types of strategies. Now, what do you do if it's obvious a pupil hasn't been listening? Now, this is a really important question, because your response to a pupil who fails to answer a question will determine and set the culture of your classroom. Is it worth listening in Sir or Mrs. lessons? That's the culture you need to establish through your response to a failure to listen. So what I would suggest doing, if someone can't answer a question and they say, "I don't know," then you ask them, "Well, what was my question?" And if they still fail to answer that question, it tells you they haven't been listening. And then you can really be very stern with them and explain to them from a position of care, of caring for them, that you really want them to succeed, and the fact that they haven't been listening is really letting you down. And so you really ought to communicate to that pupil that they haven't been listening and that there is a consequence for that. So it might be a demerit, it might be a warning for them that they need to be listening, and telling them you'll come back to them and you're expecting them to participate later on is going to be hugely important. Now, whilst on one hand you want to be stern for pupils who haven't been listening, you want to praise the contributors. So whoever has their hands up, so you pose a question such as, "What's the equation for photosynthesis?" Something you might have just explained to them. You might say, "Well done to X, Y, and Z for putting your hands up." Or you might say, "Front rows, everyone's got their hands up in the front row. What about the back row?" And really use elements of praise and competition to motivate participation. And the more excited you get at someone's contributions and someone's hands going up, the better, because it shows and signals to your class that, yes, participation is really important. And as I've said, you need to read the energy of the room. If participation is poor, go back to using lots of simple call response questions or mini whiteboards rapidly with lots of questions, because this is going to help increase the participation, and then you can re-energize the room, and then you can start to do a bit more cold calling and more difficult questions, which I'll come to in the next slide. So those strategies summarize ways that you can improve the participation ratio in your lessons by using your narration, by using very well thought out and planned simple questions that go intersperse your explanations. You explain a fact, you ask a question. You explain another fact, you ask another question to make sure they are listening. How do you make sure now that your pupils are thinking hard? This is the ultimate goal of the lesson, where everyone is thinking as hard as they possibly can. Now, of course, this is going to require you to step up the complexity of your questions. So rather than asking simple recall, you're now thinking about more tricky questions that you'd ask your pupils. It's really important to give pupils enough wait time. Again, this is a teach like a champion strategy, where once you pose a question, you're not just picking on someone straight away. You're now giving them time to think, using narration, as I said before, to increase the number of pupils who have their hands up. And you really think about the strategy. So if you're using mini whiteboards, you say, I'm going to give you 20 seconds to really think about and write down your answer. Or if you're using cold calling, or turn to your partner in this case, because you want to improve the ability and the opportunity that pupils have to really think through their answer. But if you don't give them enough time, they won't have the opportunity to think hard. They'll have a superficial answer and they'll stop at that point. You want to make sure that they're thinking enough about the answer. And there's a couple of ways that you can do that. So you might, in your head, give yourself a time to count down. You might say out loud, I'm giving you 20 seconds, 10 more seconds, once 10 seconds have elapsed, etc., etc. You might also rehearse an answer in your head as you scan the room. And you might be thinking, I would expect people to say this. And by the time it takes you to formulate your thoughts, they should have ample opportunity to formulate their thoughts as well. Insisting that pupils speak in full sentences is really important too, because it helps pupils to build connections. So when you ask them a simple question that links two facts, photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplasts, if they just say the answer chloroplasts in response to your question, where in the cell does photosynthesis take place, then they're only rehearsing that one fact. If they say out loud, photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplasts, they're then linking two ideas together. You can also make sure pupils are thinking hard by asking questions such as, how do we know that that's the right answer? Or why is it wrong to say blah, blah, blah? And these kinds of questions aren't immediately obvious. So they're more complex and they really require people to think more deeply about their answers. It's really common when you ask a tricky question to round up your pupils' answers and fill in gaps in their answers. So if they say something like, the plant needs light and therefore it can photosynthesize, and you say, yep, you're absolutely right, because the chlorophyll absorbs the light and therefore is needed for photosynthesis. What you've done there is you've added an extra fact in about the chlorophyll being the thing that absorbs the light that allows photosynthesis, and not acknowledged that your pupil didn't say that. And so if you find yourself rounding up and adding to your pupil's answers, that suggests that you're doing more thinking than they are, and therefore your thinking ratio, will be much lower than you are perceiving it to be. So catch yourself improving your pupil's answers, and if you think that you are, you need to then say to your pupil, right, so what you could say is, what's the difference between the answer I've just said and what you've just said, and get them to recognize the gap. Or you just avoid rounding up in the first place and say, use the word chlorophyll in your answer, for example. Or you might say, you're missing something there. Can you have a think about what detail you can add? Encourage them to do the thinking more than you to do the thinking. Turn to your partner, and mini whiteboards are really important strategies that you can get people to think really hard about the subject content. Turn to your partner is important because it allows people to rehearse their answers, and mini whiteboards allows them also to draft and redraft their answers and consider their words carefully before committing to writing it down. But in both cases, they aren't very high stakes in a sense that they can rub them out or they can practice and say it one more time. And that's really important to help them to improve the quality of their answers and to redraft their answers so that they're thinking and reflecting. And again, your narration becomes really important here. Giving sentence starters is another huge a way to make gains, because you set them up to use a certain structure, a certain syntax, by giving them a sentence starter, and then getting them to practice in pairs with turn to your partner or using mini whiteboards allows them to then formulate their thoughts clearly. And by giving them words to include, so you must include chlorophyll, photosynthesize, and chloroplast in your answer, means that they have a really clear checklist in their head of what to include in their answer. And then you can really focus on the quality of their answer and how they've linked those words to ensure that they're thinking hard about the content. Finally, I would encourage you to avoid using first letter cues. So if you're giving them a question such as, who can tell me in which organ of the plant photosynthesis takes place, and you say it begins with L, then, well, there aren't many other options. They're going to say leaf. And that means they're not doing much thinking. They're just very simply thinking, what words begin with L? That's linked to this topic roughly. Oh, leaf, that's the answer. They're not really thinking there. Whereas if you say in which organ does photosynthesis take place, they have to think, what is an organ in a plant? Is it the leaf, or is that not an organ? And before they give their answer, they're having to really think about it. Equally, when you're waiting for pupils to put their hands up, it's really tempting to say and give them clues so that they're thinking about the content, but you're doing some of the thinking for them. And by giving clues too early, you are reducing the thinking ratio. So avoid giving clues early, let them struggle, but obviously you want to gauge that. You don't want them floundering and not succeeding, because that would kill motivation. And so this is obviously a tricky thing to gauge, but it's something that you should be at least aware of so that you can reflect on and say, did I give a clue too early there? Or did I actually give a clue at the appropriate time that allowed them to then continue with their thinking? Right, now I wanted to talk about behavior and routines. And I've already touched on behavior and culture already, but I want to speak more explicitly about how teacher talk can be used to develop routines in the classroom. So, the first thing is this: are you clear exactly how you want your pupils to behave? Tell them this. So, if you're ever thinking something in your head, a pupil is doing this, they're fidgeting, or they are not tracking the teacher, or they are spending a lot of time on one question at the expense of others, or they are doing another behavior that you think, actually, this is not how I want them to behave because this is not the best way for them to make progress, make sure you say it out loud and make it really explicit. If you think it in your head and then don't say it, you need to bridge that gap. Use your words effectively. Secondly, routines. Now, routines are the bedrock of good teaching because they firstly build consistency, and second of all, they allow pupils to develop habits. And habits are really powerful because it means that over time, you need to say less, and they just do the thing that they've always done in your classroom without giving it much thought. And that's really important at saving time so that you can spend more time asking questions, giving explanations, and practicing answering really rigorous subject-related questions. So I have everyone at my school has really clear routine for pupils coming into the lesson, and they come in, they get their equipment out, they stand behind the chairs, 3, 2, 1 slant. We make sure everyone's focused before we say, take your seats, hand the books out, and we have a routine for handing the books out, and we do it in a timed way so that they are getting quicker and quicker at it with each succession, with each time that they do hand the books out. And very quickly it becomes such an established routine that within a minute or two of them entering the classroom, they're already well into their way of answering some recap questions. Narrate everything. Teacher talk is the most effective thing at building good habits. Every time your pupils do something that you want them to do more of, or you want more of your pupils to do, say it. So if someone has a really straight arm up, say, oh, lovely straight arm there from Maroha. Why wouldn't you say that? What's stopping you? Because the minute you say it, it becomes obvious to other pupils that this is what the teacher's expecting, and then you do it, and you find more and more pupils with their hands up. Oh, Josh is sitting up really nice and straight. He's got a great posture. Suddenly, everyone will sit up in their seats. Narrating things means that you're signaling to the class, this is something I want, and this is something that's important, and other pupils will follow in their lead. So narrating everything is so important at building good routines and establishing the behaviors that you want in your classroom. Countdown for urgency. This is such a simple trick that speeds up pupils. Every opportunity you can where something routine is happening, count down. If they're handing out books, before you get them to hand out books, you say, right, when I say go and not before, you've got 20 seconds to hand out the books. Ready, go. 20, 19, 18. Well done, front row. They're almost finished. 17, 16, whatever you're saying. The minute you start counting down, you will see an urgency in the room. And especially if you use your voice to that effect and you're counting down and you get faster. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Suddenly you'll find that they get speedier and speedier because you're counting down. You've given them a target. Kids love to win. They love competition. They love to beat your expectations. So saying things like, I bet you're not going to be able to do it in 20 seconds, or saying things like, and I've put this here, competition is motivating. My year 8s can get their books out in 18 seconds. I wonder if you can do any better. Is so powerful. I would highly recommend it. Same thing with warm praise. I've already touched on this. The more you can praise a really good answer, if someone's thought really hard and you say, I can tell you've given that answer really great thought, really, really well done. That's brilliant. That's the thing that's going to create a culture of thinking hard in your lessons. All right. So final thing I want to talk about is tips for observers. So obviously as an observer, if you're going into your colleagues' lessons, and I mean this in a low stakes sense, because I think that's the best way that teachers can develop and learn. So pop into your colleagues' lessons and say, I'm going to look out for these things that we've spoken about today, but also these couple of extra things that I think can really help. So first of all, are all pupils listening? Now, this is a really good way of improving your colleagues' radar, because you can look and see who is fidgeting, who is staring out the window, and did my colleague notice? And you can make a note of those pupils and say, these are the pupils who are doing this, so that the teacher can say, gosh, I didn't realize that, or I did see, but I didn't say anything. And that can be a really useful conversation to help improve the participation ratio in the lesson. Are explanations broken down sufficiently? This links to stuff I've spoken about in my previous talk, because if you're particularly observing a lesson of a colleague in the same subject, you will know that there are certain ideas that are quite complex, and you'll know what the pupils are expected to know by the end of an explanation really clearly. And the question you can ask is, was there anything implicit in the teacher's explanation that they didn't make explicit? And give that feedback to your colleague. Is the thinking time proportional to the difficulty of the question? Is the teacher asking a tricky question and only giving 2 seconds before they pick on someone? Or are they asking a really easy question and then giving pupils 20 seconds when really most pupils could have the answer already? And actually what they should be doing then is encouraging hands up rather than just saying, oh, I'll give you more time to think. And that can be really useful because it's tricky to gauge a sense of time when you're at the front teaching, and sometimes it's really good for an observer who's not under the spotlight and under the pressure of getting through a lesson to really get a sense of how long things are taking. Do the chosen strategies of questioning match the teacher's intention? So is the teacher using call and response to motivate and energize the class, or are they just using lots of cold calling for really simple questions where they could be using something like call or response or mini whiteboards to increase the participation ratio. When they ask really difficult questions, are they relying too much on turn to your partner really quickly and not giving people the chance to formulate their own thoughts on their own? Or are they using mini whiteboards really well for really difficult questions, but then not noticing that pupils are struggling, and therefore the feedback you could give is you could have used turn to your partner before using mini whiteboards to allow pupils to really think about their answers out loud before they commit to writing. So again, because you're an objective observer, you can kind of read the room and look for evidence for your colleague about how you think the match was between question and the strategy and the intention. Does the teacher encourage participation through narration? So when there aren't many hands up, how is the teacher responding to that? That's something you can give feedback on. Are they giving the name for when they're cold calling right at the end and using the question first? Because posing the question and then pausing and then saying the name is the best way for cold calling. Does the teacher avoid repeating the question? This is a really interesting one. Sometimes teachers need to repeat their questions if they're quite complicated or there's quite a few facts that pupils need to process. But often I find that teachers will repeat the question as a way of increasing participation and using that as a way of increasing the number of hands up and buying time. But actually that can signal to pupils that they don't have to listen to the question the first time. And so that's something important that you can give feedback on as well. Does the teacher have any tics? Now I bet I'm going to look back at this presentation and watch out for things I'm saying like and and hopefully that's not the case. But it's always useful to have someone external to recognize, are there any tics that the teacher has that they fall back on and say a lot that they could try and be conscious of and try and stop. Although it is difficult, but the first step is recognizing that you have a tic. And finally, is the teacher rounding up pupil answers? So does the teacher say, add information to a pupil's answer and say, well done, rather than saying, oh, you've missed this out, and until you give me the right answer, I'm not going to say it's 100% correct. Okay, so to wrap up then, hopefully you found those strategies really useful. And as I said before, the thing we want is more participation and more thinking. And you can do that by thinking about your narration. You can do that by thinking about how you build routines and use really economical language to say, this is what I expect of you. And also I've touched on the feedback that teachers can give. So I've mentioned a couple of times the book Teach Like a Champion. I'd highly recommend it. It's got so many strategies, 62 strategies and techniques that really help pupils to learn more. There's also a brilliant chapter, I have to give this a plug because I've contributed chapters in this myself, The Power of Culture. There's a really great chapter by Danny Quinn in there about AFL and about increasing the rigor of the questions that allow people to think more in lessons. I've also blogged on clear teacher explanations. There's still a few blogs that I will contribute to this series. There are already quite a few there, and you can find that at bunsenblue.wordpress.com. And I'd also recommend reading this paper called Principles of Instruction by Barak Rosenshine, and that contains a really nice summary of lots of the things I've spoken about today. So hopefully you found that useful. You can message me on Twitter at Mr_Raichura if you have any questions or thoughts on this talk. Hopefully you found it useful. Thank you for listening.